Hello, everyone. Welcome to the live Q&A and Talkback for Via Brooklyn's Testament, written by Tristan Bernays and directed by Lucy Jane Atkinson. My name is Ana Verde, and I had the immense privilege of being the dramaturg early on in the process, working with Tristan and Lucy on the story of the piece you just saw. I'm currently calling in from Eastern Shoshone and Goshute land in what is now referred to as Salt Lake City, Utah. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Lucy Jane Atkinson onto our virtual stage.
Hello.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
So nice to see you. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
We're also joined this evening by Testament's executive producers, Corey Hunt, who is also in the film. And we'll have Corey come on. Yes, Ian Harkins and Rafe Teresi. Hi.
Tristan and Lucy.
And Tristan is also actually on. He's joined us if he wants to come on camera. Our writer.
Maybe.
Hang on.
Hi. Hi. Happy opening. And then, of course, we have Jack Collard, associate producer. And is Danielle on? Maybe not yet. Maybe she'll join in a few. And last but certainly not least, our incredible cast of performers is also here with us this evening. So we have Duran Japal Mitchell, Jessica Giannoni, Biko Eisen Martin, and Desiree Rodriguez. And that's the whole gang. Wow. Hi, everyone. So now that we're all here, please feel free. There's a chat where you can put any questions that you may have for the team that our wonderful stage manager, Tom, will feed to me. But selfishly, I'm going to start with some questions that I have, if that's okay with everyone. Brilliant. So it's safe to say a lot of us in this virtual sort of Zoom room that we've created, I identify primarily as theater makers. But in light of COVID, not many theater makers have had the opportunity to actually produce something, to make a thing. So it's a huge feat, but I'm curious to hear from the Via Brooklyn team, our producers, what was it like to get to work on a play again, even if, of course, it was filmed, and then I have specific questions for other members of the team, but I'd like to hear from the producers first.
I mean, several times, I'm speaking for Corey and Rafe here, but several times when we actually so we pulled the trigger to do this really in early September. And I mean, just the feeling then when we actually got into the space and of being in a room with a bunch of actors, it was really inspiring. I mean, the play is about a communion of people and what that does and how that charges people in their storytelling. And it was just reflected in everything that happened to be going on with everything around us. And, you know, look, it was inspirational to get to pop our heads in and watch these artists work like they were. So thank you guys. I've gotten to see the show twice, both in rehearsals and this, and both times it's been inspirational. So thank you.
Lucy, I know that you typically are a director for the stage. What was it like? How did you approach this project differently than other projects you've worked on in the past?
It's a really good question. I think so. Tristan and I had done the show on stage previously, back in 2017. So I wasn't coming to it entirely fresh as thinking of it exclusively as a film piece. We'd already worked on it for a number of months a couple of years ago. So there was a kind of a solid theatrical foundation there. And I think that in so many ways was really, really helpful. And then in other ways was a little tricky. So many of the conversations that I had with Tristan and with you and with the Via Brooklyn team, and then in rehearsal with the actors, was just about kind of, is this a play? Is this a film? Where in that kind of spectrum does it lie? And as you know, as Ian said, the show is so much about communion and about these characters kind of, searching for understanding and searching for connection, which is something that this year everyone has been wanting so much, but also that, that's a kind of fundamental to the fabric of theatre. in a very different way to with film, where, you know, things happen much more disparately. And, you know, like with this, we're all sat in different houses, and, you know, there's no syncing up of heartbeats in the same way. But it means you have to think a lot more intricately, because you're seeing people really, really close up, and you can see every thought going on in their brains, in their eyes, which you don't get in theatre. So yeah, it just became, I guess, less about the holistic experience of sharing a space with an audience, and more about the kind of real intricacy of performance, and trying to translate that desire for communion in a different way across the screen, instead of by actually sharing a physical space.
Absolutely, 100%. And also, I want to hear from Tristan and the actors. You know, typically in a normal rehearsal landscape, all of us are in the room together. But for this, Tristan wasn't even in the same country as the actors rehearsing. So I'd like to hear from Tristan and the actors as well. I have more questions for Tristan, don't worry. But about what was it like to be in rehearsal again?
Yeah, it was really weird, because if we had done it on stage as kind of the intention was, we would I probably would have joined for the sort of end of it, maybe, and sort of been there for sort of maybe the last week and opening night. But generally, because the piece had kind of, we'd done it before in London at the Vault Festival, you know, it's kind of, it is what it is. And I was like, I don't need to be in the room hugely. There wasn't huge amounts of changes. But then, like, the last 7 years of politics happened. So there was a lot of stuff that did need sort of changing and developing. But the weird part was sort of doing it at a long distance. It was just really strange. Just the weird thing is, as a writer, a playwright in the UK, at least, you're often put on a pedestal, and people are often like, you know, you're very much kind of like, maybe not always in the best way, but it's quite a nice way, let's be honest, to be like, oh, respected and very, very nice. And then when you move to film, traditionally, writers are kind of, thank you, go away, kind of thing. And this was a weird one, because it's halfway sort of between the two. And it's weirdly more collaborative, I think, than being in theatre, actually. Like, I found this process a lot more about the discussions and debates, I think, than when we did it before. And that's probably down to the politics of the time as much as anything else. But also the fact we've done this piece before and trying something new with it. But it was just jealousy, because everyone else was out in New York having this great time filming, and I was stuck in a box in London, essentially.
Literally a box, one might say.
Literally, this is the box I live in right now.
Yeah. But, you know, I'd like to hear from Daron or Biko, Jessica, Corey. What was it like being in rehearsal after some months of maybe not?
I loved it. That's going to be my response. We haven't been able to act or use our instrument in months. And then to be able, I was just happy every single day. But the fact that we also got to do it in Central Park, like in like this epitome of New York, I think the trickiest part, because it was film and there's, you know, a minimalism to the acting, we were there with our face shields, with our face masks. And like, there was this balance of like, rehearsing your part like you're going to do it as a film, but also like they need to hear me across the field right now, especially with me and Corey, to get our lines back and forth, you know. But it was a joyful experience all around.
Even after our first rehearsal was actually Zoom rehearsal. And I just remember, I can only speak for myself, but like we were on from like 10 a.m. to about 4 or 5 o'clock. And even though, you know, we were just facing our computer screens and stuff like that, I just remember feeling filled in a way I hadn't been like inspired in such a long time. I think we read through the whole thing once, and then we just dove deep in the best way that you get to do during table work. And it was just literally like, it was, the energy was contagious, and it literally just, everybody's cogs were just turning the entire time. And I'm like, oh, this is what it is to make something. And it's only day one. Oh, thank God. And then finally being able to, even though our actual in-person rehearsals were utterly bizarre, but also amazing, as Jessica said, it was just, we were like, we weren't even 6 feet apart. I think at some points we were all like, 10 to 12 feet apart in this giant circle. It was odd, but God, I needed it. And it was wonderful.
I should say, like, just to clarify as well, like, again, calling you guys out for the heroes that you are. As anytime you had to come to rehearsals, or whenever we rehearsed and performed over 2 weeks, you guys each had to have like 6 COVID tests, because those were the regulations for New York State at the time.
There it is.
And the producers had to as well, because we were in the rooms. I don't know how our nasal passages withstood that.
The true heroes, maybe, of this project today.
And you guys were great. I mean, yes, we would set up this thing around the back of the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
There'd be like security guards, and dogs would crash rehearsal. Like kids would play tag because it's just an open park. So it was very unique. And here we are talking about these really deep, dark stories. And we're kind of like, ooh, maybe wait till like the 7-year-old walks by before we finish that thought. But it was very, very unique, and it just had such an energy to it.
Well, that's actually one of the things I wanted to ask Tristan about next, in terms of some of the themes of the piece. It's so hard, even myself, like I'm like, do I call it a film? Do I call it a play? But we'll settle on piece. This is a play that you worked on years before in 2017. And probably before that, but what about this time made you want to, revisit the story in particular? And did your thinking about the piece change at all when considering a audience? At the time we were rehearsing, it was 2020, but it would land on audiences' laps in 2021. And Shannon Harris in the chat also asked via Brooklyn, what inspired or motivated the producers to produce this piece? So sort of why now? And how did it change from 2017 to 2021?
But actually, I went back and looked at the first thing that's ever came of Testament was I first did it when we did it in 2017, and then I did Isaac's speech in like a open mic night thing in a pub theatre in London. And thank you, Duran, because you did a much better job than I did. I'm very much like in case of emergency, break open to act kind of person.
Listen, Tristan,
and it's very much on center.
Lucy
on center me, just like
Tristan was ready just in case Duran didn't pass that COVID test.
Lucy dropped that on me real quick. She said, BT does. You don't pass the COVID test. Just so you know, the writer also starred as this role. I said, oh, thank you. Great.
What? I'm needed?
Thank you.
Let me get to my makeup trailer. So like weirdly, I wrote it like 7 or 8 years ago. So a lot of stuff, like I said, has really like weirdly is very sadly sort of relevant, but also dated quite quickly, a lot of it. And also like I'm very aware, like I am very white, very English. There's lots of things that make me an outsider to it. So we did a lot of work to try and find ways of making it kind of updating, I suppose, or making it relevant to now, sort of. And I felt like they were quite so, like me and Lucy and Anna did a lot of work that was, I think, quite small and subtle, but very significant, if that makes sense. And a lot of it was, I think, about making sure that everything landed. Nothing felt forced or false or kind of felt ugly on the ear or anything like that, and just to try and make it as sort of true as possible. And that was weird, because going back to your writing from like 8 years ago and someone going, when you did that 8 years ago, why were you doing that? And you're like, I don't know. I was probably drunk maybe. But like, you're sort of having to kind of remember what it was and find new ways about doing it. But I think I really like this piece. I think it keeps going back because it's like they're all stories that were like thousands of years old and sort of keep recurring. So they're sort of like I was talking about this with someone the other day who was talking. We were talking about like a lot of my plays take place not in the now, not in the present, and I think that's partly because I don't really know much about now. But also I think that I like going back to the past because it's already out of date, so it can't get really any more out of date. You know, and if they've lasted for that many thousands of years, there's something interesting about those stories that will continue to last. So for Isaac, there's that sort of father-son dynamic that's very sad and very tragic. And for Lot's daughters, there's something really fundamentally fucked up about the fact that, you know, one of the key stories of the Bible is about incest and rape. That's very troubling. And then I find the thief a really, really powerful character because in the face of being asked by this sort of divine savior to sort of bow down and ask for forgiveness, he goes, no, why don't you ask me for forgiveness for being such a bastard to me and making me do all these things, you know? But they all feel like, even though they're thousands of years old, they still kind of ring true, I think. And I think that, like, even though I set it in America, because it felt very, like, American in my head, I think they're still kind of universal stories, because they all started in the Middle East, didn't they? And, you know, they're still told in London and in Burkina Faso and Brisbane, and they're all over everywhere there's Christians, they'll talk about these stories. So it feels like maybe that's why it was still interesting to kind of do. As to why Via Brooklyn wanted to produce it, I can only put that down to losing a bet or being something like that. I also noticed that Rafe and Ian and I were all dressed in a similar uniform, which I didn't realize we didn't get the memo.
I like it's a sort of boy band thing happening.
Yeah, very much.
That's
the whitest boy band you know.
We should be so lucky to be in a boy band. Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
I put thought into this.
I just want to say also that yeah, I mean, Ian and Corey saw this live and they kind of immediately were like shook by the piece deeply. And I didn't get to see it live. So I had to play catch up on a lot of that. But so I just kind of came on board. And then, but as time went on, I didn't even really know anything about the Bible before reading this piece either. So it was a big educational journey for me. And but it is shocking how relevant these stories can feel right now. And also just a good reminder that even a text like the Bible can be fallible in its morality and its take on morality and I love getting into spirituality too, because I'm a big old hippie at heart. So that's all I got to say about that.
Rafe is right. And to answer Shannon, your question. Hi, Shannon. She was asking what sort of got us into it. We started actively working on producing this in December 2019. Oh, what a different time as well. But I think what drew us was, you know, Via Brooklyn, and I'm speaking a little bit for the cast, the creatives. Like, I think all of us here on the Zoom, we have very different experiences with religion, believers, non-believers, people who know a lot, people who know a little. But there was something that was very interesting in this about how it examined these stories. I remember, this is going to sound very hoity-toity and radery of me, but there's an actor that I love called David Suchet, who says that the most challenging parts of acting Shakespeare, for example, are what he calls the purple passages. And those are the passages that everybody in the audience, when you're performing, is mouthing the words along with you, to be or not to be, like, you know, oh yeah, to be or not to be. I remember listening to that. I remember having to recite that in school. And I was very interested in something that made me look at something that I knew quite a bit about growing up in a new way that was also a very powerful way, and that hopefully could translate as sort of a meaningful story to people who had less exposure to the Bible stories than I had. Corey, you haven't said anything. What did you think?
I think also the kind of universality, and Rafe touched a little bit on this about faith and how, people kind of are a variation of religious, but a lot of people have a spirituality or a faith. And that idea that, even if somebody is agnostic or atheist, that idea of humanism and people coming together. And I think, Lucy and Desiree, as your role, kind of bringing together that therapy aspect and that communion. And I think somebody also in the chat was asking a question about, they are kind of separate pieces, but how to bring that together. And it's that listening to each other's stories and the common aspect that all these characters have been traumatized by faith, but they still believe on various levels. And I think everybody in their lives have, doubts about faith and perhaps go different directions, more religious, less religious from how you were brought up. And so I think in that way, especially in America, which is such a religious country, I think that was a really interesting thing because we saw it in London and we really were like, oh, we have to bring this to an American stage, to an American audience. And so that was really interesting to look at it from kind of that faith level and that communion level too.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Chelsea Guster. How did it feel to reconcile the sort of quote unquote contagious energy of the production with the serious tone and devastating events of the writing itself, and whether or not that was discombobulating, likely for the actors in rehearsal, because that's what, and also very triggering for the word contagious to be talked about in a COVID rehearsal process, but we are talking about contagious energy. So what was that experience like for the team?
I think, just to go back to talking about rehearsal for a second, as these guys have said, we were rehearsing in Central Park in kind of behind the Met. And normally, you're in a rehearsal room, and even though they are, they're 3 separate testimonies and some songs, and when we rehearsed it for the British production, a lot of the time it was like me working one-on-one with Isaac and then me working one-on-one with the daughters. And, it was separate, but there was overlap. And, while one person was kind of clearing out of the space, the other person was coming in, and we shared a cup of tea and we had breaks together, and we could be in the same room to have singing rehearsals. And there was we were able to have more of a sense of community within the production, which I think was really helpful when you are gonna sit on stage and tell these stories of trauma. And with this version, because of COVID, because we were having to rehearse outdoors, for all of these different reasons, the cast didn't, our first rehearsal day, we were on Zoom, as Desiree said, and then it wasn't until like over a week into rehearsal that we had our first kind of singing rehearsal, which was again in the park. And that was the first time that the actors had actually kind of met each other. And so there wasn't that sense of community that you normally get within an acting company in the same way. But I think that in itself was sort of helpful, because these characters don't know each other and they don't know the other people's stories, and they've all had similar experiences of kind of being hurt or being betrayed by men in their lives who believe that they know the word of God, right? And as Corey was saying earlier, like they've been harmed by religion, but they still have a huge amount of faith, and there's a huge vulnerability in kind of talking about that. And so I think there was something quite useful in, once we got to the shoot days, and it was the first time any of us had been inside a building together, to then be like, oh, well, we're inside a building together, and now we have to sit down and tell these stories. I think added, the actors can probably talk better than me, because I was just sitting there watching them all and, thinking they were amazing. But yeah, I think there was something kind of strangely additive in allowing the actors to be slightly more separate until we got together to film. In a way, it felt more truthful to the kind of the idea of these people coming together for this shared session and then going back to their separate lives. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's, yeah.
I was just going to say real quick in regards to getting to the tone, and John, I saw that mute button unmute. So if you have something to say, please say. Is all I had to do was listen to Desiree sing, to watch Duran do his piece, and watch Biko, and I was right into that tone of the piece. Like what they brought and to the level of it and the connection, every single time, every single take, just watching them all or hearing them all got me right into it.
Every single take? What was that? Every single take?
Okay.
No, I just wanted to highlight something that Lucy brought up, which I do think was really important about this piece. The both universality, but also the reclaiming of what it means to have belief in anything. I think it was so imperative that we would spend so much time in the park having discussions about our individual walks with faith and what those things mean, or even discussing, I'll never forget that day, we really just discussed the stories in the actual Bible, because so often one of the beautiful things as a pastor's son, right? It was like, oh, like, did you know in the Bible this actually happened, versus what we often see in children's stories about, like, there was no knife in the Bible, but in the fiction there is, so how beneficial it was to really lean into the individuality of each person's spiritual struggle, because I think everyone has a version of spiritual struggle. And I think it really helped connect me to the other actors, because at the end of the day, we all have our own private walk with whatever creator, the universe, for me, it's God. And this idea that if love is at the center, there's always a possibility of that hope. And I think that Tristan did a really good job of balancing the trauma with the reality that there's always love in the conflict. And if there's love in that space, then God can exist. And that for me was such a gift, because I think it challenges our historical narratives that you only experience trauma or you only experience hope. And in reality, there's always love along that journey. And that kind of really helped make this piece be more than just a commentary on anything, but rather an exploration of everything. And in 2020, that felt so right,
Definitely, I think we talked very, very early on, Lisa and I, when we were doing it back in 2017. Even though I'm an atheist, I used to go to church when I was a kid, but I'm an atheist now. But I was like, it's very important we aren't making fun of faith and religion, because that's very easy and quite tedious. Of course, to have faith requires you to believe in something that is not provable. That's the point of faith. But it's not about proving whether things right or wrong. It's about saying, why do you have faith? Like, my grandfather was Roman Catholic, and right up to the point that he died in a hospital bed in the hallway of a hospital, kind of alone, he had this enormous faith that God was with him. And I was like, for all the stuff that I madly disagreed with him about, I thought that was extraordinary, that it gave him such strength, and there must be something in it. And he always said, you should never blame God for religion. That's not his fault. And I thought that was a kind of nice thing. Even though it doesn't mean anything to me, I really like the idea of, I was having a conversation with a friend just today about, the reason I miss theatre is because for me, theatre is my church, and that sounds very wanky, but I think it's also where church literally comes from. Religion comes from theatrical attempts to kind of explain the world in many respects. And I think that if we're talking about kindness and faith, like you were talking about, Duran, very eloquently there, like, for me, it was very important not to be snarky, not to be sarcastic or bitchy in the commentary of it, just to go, these people have literally met God, seen God, experienced God. How do they feel about that? And
if I could jump in for 2 seconds too,
not
to derail the faith talk, but what I really loved about the piece was the very specific human conditions that were created. The faith seemed like a way in that was cool. And all the stories coming from Bible stories was a way in and a way to kind of get us in the same room in a weird meta kind of way. But what I really gravitated towards in the piece was just that they were all humans, terribly damaged humans that were communing around how damaged they were. And although religion was playing a piece of that, it was really their humanness and just need to express things that they've probably never expressed to anybody before. To be a man who sits in a cell by himself looking at his hand, and now all of a sudden he's in a room with people and he can talk to people. For these women who probably only experience conversation with each other, and now they're in this room talking with us as well. And you know, just the way that I just thought it was, from the first time I read it, I was just like, these are all very interesting human, you know, the religion from, I mean, not to say, you know, it was brilliant, right? All that other stuff is brilliant. But what really got me for the piece was just like the human condition, and just how deep I feel like this piece allowed us to go into different people's minds and experiences, and who have specific stories, but easily become universal because, you know, America, you know, a lot of Americans are in prison right now. A lot of American women have been abused by family members. A lot of American men have been abused by family members, their fathers. You know, if you want to look at, and the excuses or the reasons for that abuse, you know, varies, but the kind of male patriarchy, man is God kind of thing kind of looms in most of those scenarios. And I thought that this piece kind of just opened the floodgates for the expression of that in very unique ways. And that's what I loved about the piece. Not so much wrestling with the true or falseness of Christianity, you know. Although I was worried about getting struck by lightning certain times during the piece, you know, to be cursing out God so close to a big cross, you know, it's like, oh, I'm not, you know, but
I'm acting, I promise, I'm acting. Well, that feels like a beautiful way to sort of conclude our live talk back here. What a incredible piece, and I'm so thankful to even have had a small part of it. Thank you so much to everyone who logged in and watched our launch party this evening. Testament will be available for streaming until April 24th, and you can find tickets at viabrooklyn.org. And to the Testament team, one more time, congratulations. It's a huge feat, and you pulled it off. So I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and happy opening.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.